Before we jump into the story, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you like stories like this, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any of our awesome adventures. Now, let me ask you a question, and be honest. Have you ever looked at someone and thought they were weak or didn't matter, only to find out later that you were totally wrong? It's easy to assume things about people based on how they look, right? But sometimes those first impressions can be way off. I'm going to tell you about a time when a group of bikers thought they could mess with someone they didn't know. They thought she was just a normal blind woman walking in the park, not a threat at all. But trust me, they had no idea what they were about to find out. This is the story of Sarah and her dog, Shadow. It was a quiet afternoon in the city park. The sun was out, but it wasn't too hot. There were some people walking around, a few kids playing on the swings, and families having picnics on the grass. Everything seemed peaceful, like just another regular day. Sarah, a woman in her early 30s, was walking down the path, as she did every day. Sarah wasn't like most people. She couldn't see, so she had a white cane that helped her feel where she was going. Tap, tap, tap. That was the sound it made as she moved along. The cane tapped the ground in front of her to make sure she didn't bump into anything. Even though Sarah was blind, she didn't need anyone's help. She had done this walk hundreds of times. She knew this park like the back of her hand. She was confident and didn't let her blindness stop her from doing anything she wanted to do. But Sarah wasn't alone. Right beside her, walking with perfect step, was her dog, Shadow. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was a Labrador retriever, big and strong with a shiny black coat. His eyes were always alert, watching and listening carefully to everything around him. To most people, Shadow might have looked like just a regular guide dog, helping Sarah get around. And in a way, he was Sarah's helper, her guide, and her companion. But Shadow wasn't just a guide dog. He had a secret. Shadow's past wasn't something most people knew about. You see, Shadow wasn't just trained to help people who were blind. Shadow had been trained for something much bigger. Before he became Sarah's guide dog, Shadow had been a Navy SEAL K-9. That's right, a military dog. He had been trained to do things that most dogs couldn't even imagine. He had served alongside soldiers, helping them with all sorts of tough tasks. And even though Shadow was now living a peaceful life with Sarah, his skills were still there. Most people didn't know any of this. When they saw Sarah and Shadow, they just thought Sarah was a blind woman walking in the park, and Shadow was just her nice dog helping her out. They never guessed that Shadow had a past filled with adventure and danger. They didn't know that Shadow could do things that would surprise and shock them. But that's exactly what would happen that day. As Sarah walked down the path, she didn't notice the group of bikers sitting on a bench nearby. The bikers were loud, laughing, and joking around. They wore big leather jackets with patches and logos all over them. Their loud motorcycles were parked nearby, making the air smell like gas and oil. They looked tough, like they owned the place. One of the bikers, a tall man with a big beard named Jake, looked over at Sarah as she walked by. He saw her tapping her cane on the ground and thought, "What's this blind woman doing here by herself?" He chuckled to himself and nudged his friend. "Hey, look at this. Some blind lady walking in the park. But she doesn't even know what's going on." His friend, a burly man named Dan, laughed too. "Yeah, maybe we should help her out. Show her how to have a good time." They all laughed loudly, thinking it was funny. Sarah couldn't hear their words, but she could feel their eyes on her. She knew they were watching her, but she didn't care. She had learned a long time ago that some people didn't know how to treat others with kindness. It wasn't the first time people had stared at her or made fun of her, and it wouldn't be the last. But Sarah didn't let it bother her. As Sarah continued down the path, Shadow's ears pricked up. He could hear the bikers too. He knew they were laughing, and he didn't like it. Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was a protector. He had been trained to sense when something was wrong, when someone was in danger. And something about those bikers made Shadow uneasy. He didn't like the way they were talking about Sarah. He didn't like the way they were laughing. Shadow's muscles tensed, and he stayed right beside Sarah, his body ready for anything. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. Just then, one of the bikers, the same one who had made the joke about Sarah, walked up to Sarah and stood right in front of her. He crossed his arms and looked down at her with a smug smile. "Hey, lady," he said loudly, his voice full of sarcasm. "Lost your way?" Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't even look up at him. Instead, she smiled a little and shook her head. No, I'm not lost. The biker laughed. Well, maybe you should be careful. It's not safe for someone like you to be walking around all alone. Sarah didn't say anything. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to mess with her. He was trying to make her feel small, to make her feel weak. But Sarah wasn't weak. She had dealt with much worse in her life. And Shadow? Well, Shadow didn't like it one bit. Shadow's ears went flat against his head, and his teeth showed just a little. His body was stiff, like a coiled spring, ready to move if needed. Sarah could feel the change in him. She knew Shadow was on high alert, ready to protect her if the situation got worse. The biker stepped a little closer, getting bolder. What's that dog gonna do? You think he can protect you? That's cute. But as the biker reached out to grab Sarah's arm, that's when everything changed. Shadow wasn't just standing there. He wasn't just a normal guide dog. He had a history, a past that had prepared him for moments like this. And in that moment, Shadow did something that no one expected. It was a warm afternoon, and Sarah was walking along the familiar path in the park. The sun was shining brightly, but it wasn't too hot. Birds were singing, and the leaves in the trees were rustling softly in the breeze. The park was busy, but everything felt peaceful. Families were enjoying picnics, kids were running around, and people were walking dogs. But Sarah wasn't walking alone. By her side was her guide dog, Shadow. Shadow was a big, strong dog, and he was always by Sarah's side, keeping her safe. Most people thought of him as just a regular guide dog, helping Sarah get from one place to another. But Shadow wasn't just any dog. He was trained for much more. As Sarah moved along the path, her white cane tapping in front of her, she didn't notice the group of bikers sitting nearby. They were a loud group, laughing and joking with each other. The bikers were all wearing dark leather jackets with big patches on the back. Their motorcycles were parked nearby, making the air smell like gasoline and oil. They looked tough, like people who didn't take anything seriously. One of the bikers, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, was named Jake. He was the first to see Sarah walking by. He looked at her and thought, a blind lady walking in the park? This could be fun. Jake nudged his friend, who was sitting next to him. His friend was a big guy, wearing sunglasses and a black bandana. Hey, look at this, Jake chuckled. A blind lady walking all alone. Easy target. His friend laughed. Yeah, what's she gonna do? Call for help? She's got a dog, but that's it. She's all alone. Sarah could hear them. She didn't need to see them to know they were talking about her. She had heard people say things like that before. It wasn't new. People often thought that because she couldn't see, she couldn't take care of herself. But Sarah wasn't like that. She wasn't weak. Sarah was strong. She had learned to deal with people who didn't understand her, and she wasn't afraid of them. She kept walking, her white cane tapping along the path, her fingers gripping Shadow's harness a little tighter. Shadow had been her guide dog for a long time, and they had learned to communicate without words. Sarah trusted Shadow to keep her safe, and Shadow trusted Sarah to guide him. But the bikers weren't going to leave it at that. They didn't stop with their laughing or their quiet comments. One of them, a big guy with tattoos all over his arms, stood up and walked toward Sarah. He had a big grin on his face, and he was clearly trying to show off in front of his friends. Hey, sweetheart, the biker called out, his voice loud and sarcastic. Need some help? Looks like you're lost. Sarah didn't stop walking. She didn't even look up. She could tell that the man was getting closer, but she didn't let it bother her. She was used to people like him, people who thought they could treat her like she was helpless. But she wasn't. Shadow could feel the tension. Even though he couldn't see, he could sense the way the bikers were standing. He could hear the sharp sounds of their boots on the ground, feel the way they were looking at him and Sarah. Shadow wasn't just a guide dog. He was trained to protect, and he had learned to sense danger long ago. As the biker got closer, Shadow's body tensed. His tail went still, and his ears moved forward, listening closely. Shadow could tell something was off. He wasn't sure what these bikers were planning, but he knew they weren't being friendly. The biker with the tattoos came right up to Sarah and stopped in front of her. He was smiling, but it wasn't a nice smile. It was the kind of smile that made you feel uncomfortable, like he thought he was better than you. You're not from around here, are you? The biker said, leaning down so he could look Sarah in the face. He didn't care that she was blind. He didn't care that Shadow was standing beside her. But Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't let the biker get to her. No, "I'm not lost," she said calmly, her voice firm. The biker's smile grew wider, like he didn't believe her. "Well, you should be careful walking around here, lady," he said. "It's not safe for someone like you." That was it. Sarah had dealt with people like him before. People who thought they could scare her or push her around just because she was blind. But Sarah was done with that. She didn't need to prove anything to him or anyone else. But Shadow wasn't about to let the biker get too close. Shadow had a job to do, and his job was to protect Sarah. As the biker reached out to grab Sarah's arm, Shadow moved quickly, his strong body jumping forward. In one smooth motion, Shadow placed himself between Sarah and the biker, growling low in his throat. His teeth were bared, but he wasn't trying to attack. He was making it clear that no one was going to hurt his person. The biker stopped, taken by surprise. He had not expected that. Shadow was huge, and he wasn't backing down. His eyes locked onto the biker, watching him carefully. Jake, the biker who had been sitting with his friends, laughed again. "What's the dog going to do? You think he can stop us? He's just a dog." But Sarah's voice was calm, yet firm. "Shadow's not just a dog," she said. "He's a retired Navy SEAL K-9. There was a brief silence. The bikers didn't know what to say. They looked at each other, unsure if Sarah was joking or not. They had no idea what kind of dog Shadow really was. They didn't know that Shadow had been trained to do things that most dogs couldn't even imagine. Shadow's ears perked up, and he stepped forward, his body still in a protective stance. His muscles were tense, ready for whatever might happen next. He was a trained military dog, and he wasn't afraid. The bikers looked at each other, their laughs fading away. The big guy with the tattoos took a step back, his face now serious. He didn't want to get too close to a military dog. He wasn't sure what Shadow could do, and he wasn't willing to find out. "Yeah, well," the biker started, his voice unsure. "I didn't mean any harm, lady. Just messing around." Sarah didn't answer. She just kept walking, her cane tapping along the path. But Shadow didn't move from his position. He stayed close to Sarah, still keeping an eye on the bikers, making sure they didn't try anything else. As they walked away, the bikers stayed where they were, not knowing what to think. They had thought they could mess with a blind woman and her dog. They had thought they could make fun of her, tease her, maybe even scare her. But they had no idea that Sarah wasn't the one they should be worried about. It was Shadow that they should never have underestimated. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky, casting a warm orange light over the park. The bikers had been watching Sarah and Shadow for a while now, but they didn't know what to do. They had started off laughing and making fun of Sarah, thinking she was just a blind woman with a dog. But something about the situation was beginning to feel different. As Sarah and Shadow continued their walk, one of the bikers grew bolder. He was the tall one, the one who had been laughing earlier. His name was Mark, and he was getting frustrated. He didn't like being ignored. He didn't like how calm Sarah was. It made him feel uneasy. Mark stepped right in front of Sarah, blocking her path. He didn't say anything for a second, just stood there with his arms crossed. His friends watched from the bench, still unsure of what was going on. Finally, Mark sneered, looking down at Sarah. "Where you headed, miss?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You lost? Maybe you need some help." Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't look scared. She had heard this kind of thing before. But today, she wasn't going to let it slide. She had her own way of dealing with people like him. She took a slow, calm breath, and then she spoke in a voice that didn't shake. "I'm not lost," she said, her words clear. "But you might be." Her words hung in the air for a moment. Mark blinked, taken off guard. He wasn't expecting a reply like that. The bikers sitting on the bench exchanged confused looks, trying to figure out if Sarah was making fun of them. But there was something about her calmness that made them uncomfortable. Mark wasn't used to being talked to like this. He was used to people getting nervous or scared when he acted tough. But Sarah wasn't like that. She didn't seem afraid at all. She was just standing there, looking straight ahead, her hand resting lightly on Shadow's harness. Shadow stood still by her side. His dark eyes were focused on Mark, his ears flicking back and forth. The dog was completely still, but everyone could feel the tension in the air. Sarah knew that Shadow wasn't just a guide dog. He was trained for situations like this. He was a retired Navy SEAL K-9. His job wasn't just to guide Sarah. It was to protect her if needed. And right now, Shadow was waiting for a command. He was patient, but he was also ready. He knew his job well. The bikers started to feel uneasy. Mark wasn't sure what to do. He had seen tough dogs before, but none like this. He wasn't sure if he should back down or keep pushing. And that's when he made a mistake. Mark took a step closer to Sarah, looking down at her with a smirk. "You're not lost, huh?" he said. "Maybe you'll be lost if I help you find your way." His hand reached out. He was going to grab Sarah's arm to pull her aside. He thought it would be an easy thing to do. After all, she was just a blind woman, right? How could she stop him? That was his mistake. As soon as Mark's hand reached out, Shadow reacted. With a sudden movement, Shadow stepped forward, his body between Mark and Sarah. His muscles were tight, ready to spring into action if needed. His eyes locked onto Mark's hand, watching it carefully. He wasn't growling, but there was a clear warning in the way he moved. Mark stopped, his hand hovering in midair. He had thought Shadow was just a regular dog, but he quickly realized he was wrong. This dog wasn't just a pet. He was trained, and he was strong. Mark backed up, his eyes wide. He didn't know what Shadow could do, but he didn't want to find out. The rest of the bikers were watching now, more curious than ever. They had thought they could mess with Sarah, maybe even make her feel scared. But now, they weren't so sure. Sarah didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She knew Shadow had done his job. Shadow's presence alone had stopped Mark in his tracks. It wasn't the dog's size or strength that scared Mark. It was the quiet confidence Shadow carried. For a moment, the park was silent. Sarah stood still, Shadow by her side. The bikers were quiet too, unsure of what would happen next. No one moved. Then, Mark laughed nervously, trying to hide his embarrassment. Okay, you got a dog, whatever. I didn't mean any harm. Just a joke, lady." But Sarah didn't take the bait. She didn't respond to his apology. She just turned her head slightly, feeling the air around her. Shadow's body was still tense, his eyes watching every move Mark made. Sarah trusted Shadow completely, and Shadow trusted her. They made a great team. Mark's friends, still sitting on the bench, exchanged unsure glances. One of them stood up and walked toward Mark. He was the older biker with a thick beard and a deep voice. "Hey Mark," the older biker said. "Maybe we should just leave her alone. Looks like she's got it covered." Mark grumbled, but didn't argue. He took one more look at Sarah and Shadow before stepping back, giving them space. He didn't want to deal with a situation that might turn ugly. He had picked the wrong person to mess with. Sarah didn't look back as she walked away. She didn't need to. She knew that Shadow was watching her back. But that wasn't the end of it. Even though Mark had backed off, Sarah could still feel the eyes of the bikers on her. They were watching closely now, waiting to see what would happen next. They had been ready to test her, to see if she was really as tough as she seemed. But they didn't realize that Sarah wasn't just tough. She had a secret, and Shadow was part of that secret. The bikers didn't know that Sarah wasn't just any blind woman. They didn't know that she had been through things they couldn't even imagine. They didn't know about her past, or about Shadow's past. But all of that was about to change. Everything happened in the blink of an eye. The bikers had been feeling confident just moments before, but now, they weren't so sure. Mark, the biker who had reached out to grab Sarah, froze in shock as Shadow moved. It was as if the world had slowed down around them, and all the bikers could do was watch in disbelief. Shadow was fast. So fast, no one could keep up with him. His muscles rippled under his sleek coat, and with a sudden burst of power, he sprang into action. The bikers didn't even see it coming. Before Mark could even think about pulling his hand back, Shadow was already there. His mouth opened wide, and in one swift move, Shadow clamped down on Mark's wrist. It wasn't a full bite, but it was enough to make Mark stop in his tracks. The pain wasn't enough to break the skin, but it was enough to make Mark yell out. His eyes went wide in shock as he looked down at the dog's strong, powerful jaw, holding him in place. Mark dropped to his knees in an instant, his other hand tried to push Shadow off. But Shadow held firm, not letting go. He wasn't just a dog. He was trained for moments like this. His teeth were perfect for holding without causing permanent damage. He didn't need to hurt Mark. All he needed to do was show him who was in control. The bikers stood frozen, staring in amazement. They had no idea what had just happened. "What the?" Jake, one of the other bikers, gasped. His mouth hung open in shock. Mark tried to pull his wrist free, but Shadow's grip was firm, and the dog wasn't letting go. The tension in the air was thick. Mark's eyes were wide, and his heart was racing. He was scared, but he didn't know what to do. He'd never seen a dog act like this. He thought he was the one in charge. He thought he could push people around. But now, the tables had turned. Sarah stood calmly, her hand still resting lightly on Shadow's harness. She didn't seem worried at all. She was watching the scene unfold, her expression calm and composed. She had no fear. She wasn't surprised by Shadow's actions because she knew exactly what he was capable of. With her head slightly tilted, Sarah spoke, her voice steady and clear. "You really shouldn't touch people without their permission," she said, her words ringing in the quiet air. The bikers took a step back, unsure of what to do next. They were all shaken. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how a regular guide dog behaved. This wasn't something they could laugh off or brush away. They were used to the idea of guide dogs being calm and obedient, always helping their owners, always friendly. But they didn't know about Shadow's past. The tension was thick. Mark was still on his knees, trying to free himself from Shadow's grip, but he couldn't. The other bikers, who had been standing with their arms crossed, now looked uncomfortable. They exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how to handle this situation. One of the bikers, a tall guy with a rough face, stepped forward cautiously. "What kind of dog is that?" he asked, his voice uncertain. It was then that Sarah's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. She wasn't laughing. She wasn't mocking them. She was just letting them in on the secret. "Shadow isn't just a guide dog," she said, her voice calm but with a touch of authority. "He's a retired Navy SEAL K9. There was a long pause. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped moving. The bikers stood in silence, their eyes wide with disbelief. They had no idea. They had no clue who they were messing with. They hadn't just angered a blind woman. They had made the mistake of trying to mess with a dog trained by the military. A retired Navy SEAL, K9. A dog who had been trained to work alongside soldiers, trained to protect, to fight, to respond to threats in ways most people couldn't imagine. The bikers' faces turned pale. The color drained from their cheeks, and they suddenly looked a lot smaller. They had no idea how to react. They were terrified, but they didn't want to show it. Their confidence had vanished in an instant. Mark, still on his knees, looked up at Sarah with wide eyes. "A Navy SEAL K9?" he repeated, his voice trembling. What does that mean?" Sarah didn't answer him right away. She didn't need to. The bikers were already starting to put things together. They had crossed a line, and they knew it. One of the other bikers, the one who had been sitting on the bench, stepped forward. He looked like he was about to say something, but then he stopped. He saw the way Shadow's eyes never left Mark. He saw the way the dog was still holding on to Mark's wrist, not even flinching. It wasn't just a dog. It was a warrior, a soldier. "Yeah," Sarah said softly, her voice almost like a whisper. "Shadow was trained to protect. He's been through things you can't even imagine." The bikers were speechless now. They stood there, looking at each other, unsure of what to do. They had made the mistake of underestimating Sarah and Shadow. They thought they could bully her. They thought they could take advantage of her. But they didn't know who they were really dealing with. The silence stretched on, and for a moment, Sarah and Shadow stood there in control of the situation. The bikers were no longer sure of themselves. They were no longer the intimidating figures they had been just moments ago. Finally, after what felt like forever, Mark spoke. His voice was shaky, full of fear. Okay, we're sorry. We didn't know. We didn't know about the dog." Sarah didn't say anything at first. She just watched him, her expression serious. She wasn't about to let them off the hook just because they were scared. They had tried to hurt her, to make her feel weak, and that was something she wasn't going to let slide. Slowly, Sarah reached down and gave Shadow a gentle pat on the head. Shadow released his grip on Mark's wrist, and Mark pulled his hand away quickly, rubbing it as if trying to shake off the pain. But the look in his eyes said it all. He was shaken. He had learned his lesson, and the other bikers knew it too. The bikers took a few steps back, their eyes still wide. They didn't know what else to do. They had crossed a line they couldn't come back from. Sarah finally spoke, her voice firm. "Now you know. I suggest you leave us alone." The bikers didn't argue. They didn't try to make jokes or act tough anymore. They didn't say a word as they turned and started walking away, one by one. Their heads were down, their shoulders hunched. They knew they had made a huge mistake. Sarah and Shadow watched them go, standing tall and proud. They didn't need to say anything. The bikers had learned their lesson the hard way. As the bikers disappeared into the distance, Sarah turned to Shadow and gave him a small smile. "Good job, Shadow." And just like that, the moment was over. The park was quiet again, and everything seemed peaceful. But Sarah knew that things would never be the same. Not for the bikers, and not for her. They had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving. The tension in the air was thick as the bikers stood there, their faces still pale from the shock of what had just happened. They had come into the park full of confidence, ready to pick on a blind woman and her dog. But now, they were completely unsettled. They had underestimated Sarah and her dog, Shadow, and they had learned a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. Jake, the leader of the group, finally raised his hands in the air. His voice was shaky, and he tried to sound calm, but his words were laced with fear. "Look, lady," he said, his eyes darting nervously to Shadow. "We were just messing around. No harm meant." Sarah didn't respond right away. She just stood there, calm and steady, her hand gently resting on Shadow's harness. Shadow, on the other hand, was still on high alert, his eyes fixed on the bikers. His muscles were relaxed, but there was a quiet strength in the way he stood. He was waiting for his owner's next command, ready to act again if necessary. Sarah's voice was quiet, but firm. "That's what I thought." Her words weren't harsh, but there was a certain finality in them. She wasn't going to let them off easily, not after what they had done. They had tried to intimidate her, to bully her, and now they needed to learn that actions like that had consequences. Without another word, Sarah gave a quiet command. It was simple, just a soft word that only Shadow could hear, but it was enough. Shadow immediately released his grip on Jake's wrist, stepping back to stand beside Sarah as if nothing had happened. His tail gave a slight wag, almost as if he were pleased with the way things had turned out. But his eyes never left the bikers. He was still watching them, his posture proud, daring any of them to try something else. The bikers were shaken. They had been so sure of themselves just a short while ago, but now they were scared. They had thought they could pick on a blind woman, make her feel small, maybe even get a laugh out of it. But now, they had no idea what to do. They had made a huge mistake, and they knew it. Jake looked around at his friends. They were all staring at Shadow, looking more and more uncomfortable by the second. One by one, they slowly started backing away, their eyes wide, their heads lowered. They didn't want any more trouble. They just wanted to get out of there, to put some distance between themselves and the dog that had just proven they weren't as tough as they thought they were. Jake was the first to turn around. He quickly walked toward his motorcycle, his boots tapping loudly on the pavement as he moved. His friends followed close behind, all of them trying to act like nothing had happened, but the fear in their eyes told a different story. Without a word, they climbed onto their bikes. The engines roared to life one by one, and within moments, the group of bikers was speeding down the street, leaving the park behind. The sound of their motorcycles grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared altogether. Sarah and Shadow stood there, watching them go. There was no need for celebration, no need for a victory dance. The bikers had learned their lesson, and that was enough. The park slowly returned to its peaceful state. The birds were still singing in the trees, the leaves rustling gently in the breeze. Everything seemed normal again. But for Sarah and Shadow, this moment was far from ordinary. A few people who had witnessed the whole thing stepped forward. They had been watching from a distance, unsure of what was happening at first. But now they knew. They had seen the bikers pick on Sarah and Shadow, and they had seen how the tables had turned. They had seen Sarah stand her ground, and they had seen Shadow protect her when she needed it most. One by one, the bystanders began clapping. It started softly, just a few hands coming together in appreciation. But soon more and more people joined in. They were clapping for Sarah, for Shadow, for the way they had handled the situation with grace and strength. It wasn't about violence. It was about standing up for what was right and showing that nobody should be picked on or disrespected, no matter who they were. Sarah smiled gently, her hands still resting on Shadow's harness. She wasn't looking for praise, but it felt good to know that others had seen what had happened and appreciated how she and her dog had stood strong. She didn't need to explain anything. The bikers had learned their lesson, and that was enough. As the clapping died down, a young boy who had been standing nearby walked up to Sarah. He was maybe 8 or 9 years old, and he was looking up at her with wide eyes. That was amazing, he said, his voice full of excitement. You and your dog. You made them leave. You were so brave. Sarah chuckled softly, crouching down to his level. Thank you, sweetie, she said with a smile. But I couldn't have done it without Shadow. She gave Shadow a gentle pat on the head, and he responded by giving her a small, happy wag of his tail. The boy looked at Shadow, his eyes full of awe. Is he really a retired Navy SEAL K-9? He asked, his voice full of wonder. Sarah nodded. Yes, he is. He's been through a lot in his life, but now he's retired and just helping me out as my guide dog. The boy's eyes widened even more. Wow, that's so cool. You must be really lucky to have him. Sarah smiled softly, feeling a sense of pride. I am, she said simply. He's not just a dog. He's a hero. The boy nodded, his face lighting up with admiration. I want to be like you when I grow up, brave and strong. Sarah felt a warmth in her heart at his words. She patted his head gently. You can be anything you want to be, she said. But remember, being brave doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes, being brave means standing up for yourself and for others. The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful. I'll remember that, he said. As the boy walked away, Sarah stood up and turned to Shadow. She could feel his calm presence beside her, his strength and loyalty shining through. She had always known that Shadow was special, but today, he had shown just how incredible he really was. The scene at the park had ended, and the bikers were long gone. But Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not because she had won, but because she had stood up for herself. She had made sure that the bikers learn a lesson they would never forget. They had tried to mess with the wrong person, and now they knew the consequences. Sarah turned to walk away, Shadow by her side, as always. She wasn't looking for trouble. She wasn't looking for confrontation. She was just going about her day, living her life and standing tall. She and Shadow didn't need anyone's approval. They were strong on their own. As they walked down the sidewalk, Sarah felt the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. The bikers were gone. The crowd had dispersed. The park was peaceful once again. And Sarah? She knew that whatever life threw at her, she and Shadow could handle it together. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They just needed to keep moving forward side by side. And as they walked away, Shadow's tail swayed back and forth, a quiet symbol of the bond they shared. A bond built on trust, respect, and the unspoken understanding that, together, they could face anything. Sarah stood still for a moment, letting the quiet of the park wrap around her. The wind gently rustled the leaves in the trees above, and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over the peaceful scene. Shadow, her loyal companion, stood beside her, his ears perked up and his body calm. He always knew when it was time to slow down and rest, and now was one of those moments. She smiled softly as she reached down to give Shadow a scratch behind his ears. He wagged his tail gently, his eyes bright with contentment. Good boy, she said, her voice soft and full of love. Shadow's tail gave a little wag in response, a simple but meaningful sign that he knew he had done well. For a moment, everything felt perfect. They had faced down a group of bullies together. They had stood strong, and they had won, not through violence, but through trust, strength, and calm resolve. Sarah had known all along that she didn't need to fight with her fists. She had something more powerful than that. She had Shadow, her incredible guide dog, who had proven to everyone around that appearances could be deceiving. Sometimes, people look at others and think they know who they are. They think they understand what someone is capable of just by looking at them. They think they can judge a person by what they see on the outside. And that's exactly what those bikers had done to Sarah and Shadow. They had assumed that because Sarah was blind, she was weak. They thought that because she had a guide dog, she was an easy target. But they couldn't have been more wrong. Sarah had always known that she wasn't helpless. Just because she couldn't see the world the same way others didn't mean she was any less strong. She had learned to rely on her other senses, her instincts, and most importantly, the deep bond she shared with Shadow. Together, they made an unstoppable team. And that's something that couldn't be seen just by looking at them. It was something that had to be experienced. Those bikers had thought they could pick on Sarah just because she seemed vulnerable. They thought that maybe, just maybe, they could scare her into submission. But what they didn't know What they could never have guessed was that Sarah had a secret weapon by her side. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was a hero. He had been trained for intense situations that most people would never have to face. He was strong, fast, and incredibly intelligent. He had served his country, protecting others in ways most people could only imagine. And now, he was protecting Sarah. Shadow was more than just a guide dog. He was her partner, her protector, and her friend. And together, they made a perfect team. Sarah thought about how the bikers had backed off, how they had scrambled to get away when they realized they had messed with the wrong person. It had all happened so quickly, and yet it had felt like a lesson for everyone who had witnessed it. It wasn't about causing harm or making someone suffer. It was about standing firm, about showing that strength comes in many forms. Sometimes strength is quiet. Sometimes it's not about being loud or violent. It's about staying calm, standing tall, and knowing that you have what it takes to handle whatever comes your way. Shadow had been the one to take action when it was needed, but Sarah had been the one to stay calm. She had trusted Shadow completely, knowing that he would do what needed to be done. And that trust had been enough to turn the situation around. Sarah glanced at Shadow again, her heart swelling with pride. He was always by her side, always ready to protect her, and always willing to do whatever it took to keep her safe. And she knew that no matter what happened, as long as they had each other, they would always be okay. The world might look at Sarah and think that because she was blind, she was at a disadvantage. But they couldn't have been more wrong. She had Shadow by her side, and with him, she knew she was stronger than anyone could ever imagine. No one could take that away from her. As Sarah and Shadow walked away from the scene, their footsteps steady and sure, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The bikers were gone, the situation was over, and the world was right again. But she also knew that this moment would stay with her. It wasn't just about standing up to bullies. It was about understanding that true strength doesn't always look the way people expect it to. True strength comes from within, from trusting yourself and those who are there for you. And sometimes, true strength is shown in the quiet moments, the ones that others don't even notice. Sarah knew that, moving forward, she would keep standing tall. She would keep walking through the world with Shadow by her side, never letting anyone underestimate her or her dog again. The world might not always understand her, but that didn't matter. She didn't need their approval. She had something much more important, her own strength and the strength of her incredible dog, Shadow. As they walked through the park, Sarah's heart felt lighter than it had in a long time. She had stood up for herself, and Shadow had proven just how powerful a bond between a person and their dog could be. They had made it through the situation together, and that was what mattered. Sarah looked down at Shadow, and he looked up at her with his calm, steady eyes. It was like he understood everything she was feeling. In that moment, she didn't need words. The bond they shared spoke louder than anything else. They didn't need to prove anything to anyone. They had each other, and that was enough. And maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson for everyone who had witnessed what happened. Sometimes the most powerful protectors come in the most unexpected forms. You might think you know someone based on what you can see, but that's not always the case. Sometimes the people or animals you least expect are the ones who will surprise you the most. And if you ever find yourself judging someone based on how they look or what you think you know about them, remember Sarah and Shadow. They'll remind you that strength comes in many forms, and it's often the quietest, most unassuming ones who are the strongest of all. So, the next time you see someone who seems different, someone who doesn't fit the mold, take a moment to think twice. You might just be looking at someone who has more strength and courage than you could ever imagine. And remember, the ones who judge by appearances, they're the ones who never see it coming.